We're live. Are you starting or am I?
You are.
Oh, you were interviewing me today, so I didn't know it was me.
Oh,
That's fine.
True.
All right. Welcome to another episode of Getting Started.Life. Sorry about that stutter step in the beginning. A show about starting new things, right? It's about new endeavors, what you need to do to start that new endeavor, and the one mistake to avoid. And I'm going to turn it over to Marya now. Well, actually, first, this week's show brought to you by Divorce Housing Pro. If you're getting divorced, your house is your biggest asset. If you're not thinking about it differently than you would any other situation, you're probably missing something. I can tell you from experience as the Divorce Housing Pro that you are missing something. So if you have questions, go to divorcehousingpro.com, and brought to you by Keystone Mediation. What do you want to say something about Keystone Mediation real quick?
Keystone Mediation is your center for conflict resolution. The number one thing that we hear is that people wish they'd known about us when they're going through a divorce.
And we're talking full service mediation, right? You do every kind of mediation out there.
Yep, divorce.
All right, rarity. I'm going to stop talking for a minute and turn it over to Marya.
Our guest today is our very own one and only Doug Katz, who's probably the king of starting new things, a Renaissance man in his own right, which leads us right into today's unique hobby of making knives. So if you've ever wanted to make your own knives, or even have the metal forging and that type of stuff, Doug's going to tell us a little bit about it.
Right on.
So I've been with you when you come up with many an idea. What made this one interesting, or what made this one resonate with you?
Believe it or not, this one was more it started as a gift of a really beautiful knife from my wife, from a guy who makes knives named Steve Marney here in the Chicagoland area. Unbelievable. He's the guy who taught me, and I'm going to talk about that. And she really connected with him, and they were chatting, and he talked about that he teaches a class. So my son and I took the class. She thought it would be a great father-son thing. And I had been watching Forged in Fire, right? So everybody's been watching that. I was actually watching it last night. And now the contestants, when they're giving their introduction, they're usually like, oh, I watched the show and I decided to do it. And it seemed like something really cool. And it just really resonated with me. And I think the why I took it to the next level past the class, actually, Cece and I were talking right before this, before you joined in the green room area, is there's this really cool intersection of art and practicality, right? Like if you look at a knife, even a very simple knife, there's a beauty in simplicity. There's a beauty in function and design. Like when you start making them, you're like, I always knew there were a lot of knives, but there's a lot of different knives out there for a different purpose. And when you can marry those up, there's something so cool about that for me. And frankly, I think today we're a society of consumers. We consume. And not enough people produce. They don't produce things that are a reflection of them. And I think for me, it became an outlet for that. It became somewhere where I'm not looking at numbers. Nobody's judging me. I'm just going to create something. And if it turns out a piece of crap, I can throw it on the scrap heap or just set it aside. And I've gotten a very different perspective on life through forging, where there'll be a mistake or something and I'll be pissed off and I'll set it aside. And a month later, I'll be like, I got it. And that was like this knife. This one was a mistake. And like I went back and made something I really love out of it. And that's a really cool life lesson. So for me, it's the intersection of a lot of different things, which I would hope most people's diversions are.
Well, I think that's interesting too, because, I think of myself as not artistic at all, right? I can't even if I draw a stick figure, it's probably crooked. But artistic outlets don't have to be traditional art, right?
You just haven't found your medium, right? Like
creative outlet. It could be graphic design. It could be making knives. It could be landscaping art. If you like working in your garden, it could be a lot of different things.
Yep. Oh yeah. And I think, I'm in a unique situation right now with an elderly parent that lives with me. And that has sent a very strong signal to me too, that you should have hobbies, that when you retire, there should be things that you are looking forward to having more time to do. And I think the creative ones a lot of times are those. And that's where you can really hone your skill. Pardon the pun. I didn't even mean that. But then you'll already sort of have a passion for it and experience, because certain things take less time to learn, but I am learning that this takes an immense time. It's simple in many ways. It's not easy. And there's so much to learn that all of a sudden when you get into it, you're like, holy crap.
Interesting. When I first started really getting interested in cooking years and years and years ago, I wanted to buy my first big girl set of knives, right? And you go to, I think I went to Macy's at the time, and there were so many different knife manufacturers just for chef knives, right? And they all feel different, and they're all weighted different, and some are made for, women's hands more so than men's hands, because generally we have smaller hands. And I think that was the first time I realized that knives were really that different and that interesting.
Well, and they're really underappreciated. And when I started making knives, you don't usually work in stainless, right? You're typically working in high carbon steel, which will rust. Some are more resistant to rust, but you have to care for it. And the degree that something was, for part of human history, a key thing, like people carried knives, even, that was how they survived, whether it was a stone knife or whatever. Now it's an afterthought. It gets thrown in the dishwasher. Like when I made a chef's knife and we were kind of using it in the house, like it got rusted really quickly because I was the only one drying it. And I didn't really blame anybody when I realized everything is stainless, everything is disposable, everything is a certain way. And that was another unique thing that really jumped out at me.
Okay, so let's jump in. Let's say that I've watched the show and I'm ready to, try and tackle some of it myself. What would be the first step to getting started in making my own knife?
So I'm assuming, of course, it's somebody who was like me, watching Forge and Fire. That's cool. I really want to do it. Because what I found is I've run across people who've done this for a long time just because like they had a parent or a friend who did it, or they really had this like desire. But there's a lot of people now who've been exposed to it, which is one of the great aspects of technology.
Yep.
But my question is, figure out why. Do you want to make a knife and say bucket list checklist? Or are you like, I really like knives? And I think that the important first step is to say, again, is it a diversion for a short time, or is it something you really have a passion for? And with that, I really think, and this is, sort of going into step 2, but I'm going to kind of bring them together so that it's really one step, is find people who do it. You would be amazed at the people in general, like you and I hosting this show. These people come on and you're like, I never would have thought that's what that person does, or that they're into it. The person that we had on to talk about voiceovers does like trapeze stuff. You look at people do things. And while I'm generally down on social media and down on the internet, I think it's really a destructive force. The one thing it does bring together is the ability to find people. Yep. And if you can find someone who does it, Smiths, they don't feel like there's some arcane knowledge, right? That they don't want. They love talking about what they do, and they love teaching, and they love if they make you, because they hate to see a shitty knife, right? So they're like, if you're making knives, so figure out why you're doing it. And the why could be find someone who does it and go make one knife and be like, okay, I just want to make one and see how it goes. And I think some people get addicted to the clang and all the stuff. And other people just look and go, okay, I did it. Like, maybe I'll do it again, but it's not where I'm at. And I think what I've realized through the show, like you and I doing the show and my own endeavors, is you quit a hobby that you try when there's no passion. When you have a hobby that you really want to do and you figured out the why, issue is a setback, right? Like you're like, oh my God, if I had the first couple knives I made, I would have quit, right? The first ones I made with my mentor were beautiful. And I'm like, okay, I can do that. And I was like, no, I can't, because I figured out there's so much to learn. Because the passion was there, because the why was to make knives and not a knife. I mean, heck, we bought this house partly to give me space to do it. So, and I'm not saying everybody has to go there, but it also provides the ability to not have to go all in. It's expensive startup. You can find, like, Facebook Marketplace and I are best friends right now, but you can find things pretty inexpensive. And I don't know anybody out there who I found in any community who was like, hey, let me know when you're working on stuff. Can I come and shadow you? Never heard a no. And you could even be so nice as to say, hey, I'll pay you for your time, or let me buy you dinner, like make their time worthwhile. But you can usually find some. If I was lighting up the forge and someone was like, hey, can I come by? I'd be like, sure, because the climate guy in me, the guy who worries about that, says, I'm already kind of hurting the climate because I got all this propane going. If I could have 6 people sharing the forge, they would all need their own anvil. That's an ability to do it, and it's cool. You see what people are working on, and you can get opinions. So, the big one is the why, and that's, I think, the only way you can do the why is to do it once, and to be like, oh, like, again, Cece and I were talking in the beginning before we came on, and we were talking a little bit about making one, right? And I'm this is like one project right now, and I'm making it. It's out of a lawnmower blade. I'm going to talk about that in a minute as well. So yeah, it was right there. But the finish work is what takes a long time, and I think people see the show because I'm basing a lot of people's desire to start doing this based on what they watch on TV. And you've got an hour-long show where they go through 2 processes of doing it. It takes a long time to do the finish work. And some people might look and say, oh, I'm not cut out for that part of this, right? Like, I'm not cut out to sit in my workspace for 5 hours with a file, making sure that 4 different parts of the handle go together. And the why is really important for that, right? So if you like making knives and you've got kind of the engineer thinking of like, I want to solve problems, boom, it's great, right? But if you're like, that's just going to piss me off, I'm not into that, well, that's a whole different thing, right? And I'm going to talk about that later. So then really, I hope that really covers, figure out why you want to do it. And what I would say is what you may find out is you like the medium of metal, but you don't want to make knives. So make something else, right? Like, it'll help you maybe find a hobby that you didn't even think of.
But even more towards the beginning. So I just did a quick Google search to confirm in my head, like, how would I even find a knife maker near me? Because I just Googled knife maker near me, and there's nothing.
You can go on Facebook or any,
Yeah.
I'm guessing any, but Facebook, I think, tends to be the best. Or go onto YouTube. A lot of videos out there. I'm talking about that in another step. But you can go out there, and those forums have a ton of people talking. And what's great is it's nobody talking the way that they are on the internet right now everywhere else. It's like, hey, I have this problem. If you go on one of these forums and say, I have this problem, you're going to get a lot of answers.
Yeah.
And if the question in the forum is to say, I've never done this, who lives in Chicago's northwest suburbs, or who knows somebody in that area who makes knives, who would let me come and hang out for a day. Okay. It's pretty hard to find retail knife makers. They just don't do it. Or again, you could go online and look for handmade knives and see if there's anyone in that area. It might take a little work, but it'll save you a lot of time because, again, it's expensive. Mine is mostly Harbor Freight, but like you have to have like a really good grinder. If you're going to do this a lot, that's probably $1,000, right? So, but I also know people who will say, I'm going to do it. And this is the other finding out why is like literally doing it in your backyard. You can basically kludge together a charcoal forge out of a grill. You could kind of make a knife, right? Or you could, if you've got tools to take a piece of steel and cut it in the shape of a knife, you can find a way to make one. It's pretty hard. So I don't know if that's the best way to start, but you could figure that out. But there are a ton of people out there who would help. And that shadowing part, I'm telling you, is really important because you also might forge a relationship that keeps you in the hobby, right? Like you'll have somebody to call who you can send a picture and go, I'm having this real huge problem. Or like I bought my forge from my mentor and it stopped working. Like there were some issues with the jets. And I was like, hey, what can I do? And it was like a really easy solution, but I wouldn't know. How would I know, right?
Right. So step number 1, figure out your why. Step number 2 is
Find somebody, find people, get exposure to it without having to have too much of a time or financial commitment. And I would say it's almost like any other thing. If you could shadow a couple of different people, then it's not the worst thing to do, because you may pick up something different that sells you on or gets you away from a hobby where you'd be wasting your time. And I think that's really, really important, right? Like, it's important to not jump into something that's really, really expensive. Now, also, I would guess in some of the bigger cities, there's probably shared workspace where, not everybody has the workspace I ended up with. I was very lucky. So I have seen on TV where you see people working in a shared space. I don't think it would be outside of the realm of possibility to find a place where people work together and they would say, hey, we're looking for another guy, right? And that might be a good way to expose yourself to that. I have never come across, I haven't needed to, but I know that kind of stuff is out there.
Where you took your original class, was there any type of...
Well, I found out about that through pure luck, through Kim, my wife, talking to Steve, who's now my mentor, but he was like, hey, I teach this class. Would Doug like to do it? And we were lucky. He did his first father-son class with me and Gabe. And it went well, but it was really nice having that. It was like a full 5-day class. He doesn't teach anymore. He's got some arthritis issues and things like that. But there's other guys out there. And I think if you take the time, I think the time investment up front is doing these kind of things, figuring out if you like it, figuring out if there's other people in the area, figuring out, start thinking about if it is something you want to do, where you're going to get stuff, right? And I talk about budget next, but the other why, and we talked about knife and knives, and I want to go kind of full circle because I know we're coming up on a commercial break. The other why is sometimes you can feed another passion by doing this. And for me, it's reuse. So I have all that wood back there for knife handles. I found a place to get it free, which I will not share online because I don't want to compete with anybody. But all of that, one, would have cost me a lot of money. And two, it's in a dumpster. So I go there, so I get that for free. I'm making this out of a lawnmower blade. It's admittedly not the best steel to make a knife out of. I'm like, I don't really care. Like, I'll have to sharpen it more. Who cares? Again, this eagle on this came from the top of a flag, like a flagpole on your house, when I screwed up the bottom, and I was like, what can I do? And I'm like, okay, I'll use that because I was going to throw it away. And for me, like, the other why is I feel like I'm creating something questionably of beauty. We'll see how good I get at it, but it would have ended up in a landfill.
Okay.
And really, the only thing that I'm having to buy these days is like the brass for something like this. I haven't found a lot of tools. Like, once you start getting into it, you figure about different metals, which I know very little about right now, but you can use tool steel. Tool steel is hardenable typically. So I went on Facebook Marketplace and I was like, hey, does anybody have any old tools I want to get rid of? Hatchets, axes, anything. I want to play around with it. There was a guy like in the suburb next door who had this is for effect here. This, right? I'm going to make 1 million knives out of this stuff. So the why could be some other aspect of like bringing other passions to bear, right? Like in art, it might be an expression on a cause you like. For me, it's having less waste. And at the end of the day, having someone go, I can't believe you made that. And I said, I paid nothing for it. All the pieces. It drives my wife crazy because any little piece of metal or something that I could see being used in a handle, I'm like, no, I'm going to keep it. And as long as it's organized, I'm good to go. So I think that's another really good thing. And as you shadow people, you can kind of pick up on some of that stuff.
Sounds great. I like the sustainability and the eco-friendly side of it as well. We're going to go to a quick commercial break, and we'll be right back.
You're getting divorced and you have to come up with a plan for your likely biggest asset, your home. What next? What is seemingly easy is anything but. There are a huge number of considerations to address to determine the best course of action. But where can you turn? A good place to start is the Divorce Housing Pro. The Divorce Housing Pro helps divorcing homeowners determine and execute a plan to resolve the sometimes complicated disposition of the marital home or homes. As the Divorce Housing Pro, I can advise you on the available options and work with you to determine the optimal one. I can provide focused mediation services to work with the divorcing couple to find the best option that serves both spouses in an equitable manner. Finally, I can provide lending support to assist you in applying for the best loan option and securing a loan to begin your Act 2. It's your most important asset. Go with a pro. Divorce Housing Pro. Loan consultation, mediation, and advice. Mediation services provided by the Divorce Housing Pro through Keystone Mediation. Lending services provided through strategic partners. Divorce Housing Pro is not a lender, does not accept applications, underwrite, or process loans, nor do we make credit decisions.
All right, we are back.
We are back. Oh, by the way, I did want to, because I noticed all you can see is that I would grind that. There's a knife there. It's not of a questionable nature, but I was going to say it does help having a spouse that's like on board. This was my Father's Day gift this year. So, but I stepped on your return from the commercial. So I'm sorry about that.
You are listening to the Getting Started That Life podcast on the WGSN-DB Going Solo Network. And today we are talking to Doug Katz, our very own. And this second half of the show is sponsored by Red Leg Funding and Keystone Mediation, as well as Divorce Housing Pro.
Awesome.
We have gone through our first two steps of kind of getting started with making knives. Number one is getting to know your why, figuring out if you want to make a knife or knives, make a hobby of it. And number two is finding people who do it, see who you can shadow, see who you can learn about the different materials from. What is step number 3?
Figure out what budget you got. As I said in the beginning, the cool thing is you can find a lot of free stuff. You can find a lot of used stuff. But let's say, and I think step 3 sort of assumes that you are in on it, right? Like you've decided, hey, I want to make some knives. And I want to go forward with this, and then figuring out, okay, what can I do? Like, what can I do myself? Right. You might, when you talk about equipment and let's say shared space, like you might want to buy a forge, cause those aren't that expensive. But you need like a grinder, like is more important. So you might get all this other stuff, but you buy the wrong thing. So I think as you talk to other people, right? Like you've already gone through that step of finding people, either virtually or in person. And you say, hey, I want to do this. And I got about $1,500 to get started. Let them help you. You never know. One of them, like, again, for me, my mentor was like, hey, I'm getting rid of my forge. I'll sell it to you at a great price. And he was like, I'm getting rid of a bunch of other stuff too. I'm going to give you a stick welder and all kinds of. So you may happen upon some great things when people use that as a reason to move forward. But you've got to figure out what your startup budget is and figure out what your budget is for material as well, because that might change how you approach it, right? You might be like, well, I'm really into this and I want to make really great knives, like make really good chef's knives. Well, if you're making something that is purpose built, and you're not just kind of like going in a lot of different directions, you may have to buy some really specialized steel. You may or not be able to find it. Like a lot of steel comes from China. There was a time during COVID where a lot of guys were like, I can't find any steel, like of a certain kind, because if there's supply chain issues, it could affect you. So figure out what you have to spend both financially and time-wise. And I say that because from experience, I was like everything else, right? I think people's starting a new endeavor is like this, and then it kind of, goes off, but it's going to plateau. If it goes all the way down, they quit, right? But in the beginning, they're like, I'm really into this.
Yep.
And I was, and then life happens, right? And, it just, things got busy, family things, kids, sports and all that. And I was like, I felt like I was not getting out here enough and my projects were half finished. But I really didn't do the right budgeting exercise to say, how much time can I really do? All the tools I have, except for maybe the forge, are multitaskers, right? Like I built a Halloween costume for my son out here when he couldn't find a Freddy Krueger glove. I had everything out here. So I didn't feel like my tools were getting wasted. I just felt like I wasn't working enough on what I wanted to do. And then I just did a rebudgeting and said, okay, what am I doing when I could be out here? Right? Like the other priorities are priorities. And there's times like, I'm sitting on my ass watching TV. Well, I put a TV out here, right? So now if there's a football game on or something that I want to watch, I don't have to sit there and watch every play. I can come out here and work and do that. But I don't think I was really realistic on my time budgeting. I was lucky because, again, a lot of the stuff I inherited and whatever reason, the equipment, the financial budgeting. But again, you will get very, very ingenious if you look and hold yourself kind of to a budget, because some things you can't get for free, like belts for a belt sander or new blades for a bandsaw. Those are just, they are what they are. But again, pieces for a knife can all come from other places. Like I was doing a lot of practice knives, like this one I still have to finish, but this was like an old bandsaw blade. I got a box full of these blades and they're limited in what you can do. But I got a box full of these on eBay for like nothing. And I use them for spacers. I use them for all kinds of things. But this is great for practice. This was free. This was free. This was pretty much free. This was free. Like I had a contractor who came over once and he was working there and he's like, hey, can I use your dumpster? Because we had a big dumpster out in front. He goes, my son had a spoiler on his car and he got to get rid of it. I can't put, so I'm like, all right, whatever. And I went in there. I'm like, oh, it was all like really, really good aluminum, like these big sheets of big, thick. I'm like, you're not throwing that stuff out. It's all down here right now. So I think setting that budget also makes it so that you can find interesting ways to keep that cost down. And there are a lot of them out there. And again, that's a great way to go to people in the forums and stuff and be like, hey, where can I find components to be able to do this stuff? So,
well, I think you touch on something important too when you're talking about a time budget, right? It's not just a financial budget. For me to try and carve out, say, an hour a day for a new hobby right now just wouldn't be feasible with family and work and stuff. So if I'm going to invest in a new hobby, I have to be realistic, not only about the financial budget, but about my time commitment. And
right. Well, it's like golf widows, right? I've heard of the golf widow comment. But for me, it was more not wanting to create forge orphans and a forge widow, right? Like you only have so much time. Now, full disclosure, I was hoping it would be more where my kids would come out and do it and hang out with me. And they have on occasion, but, they just don't think it's as cool as I do. So, but I will tell you this. Their friends, they think like you're the coolest thing ever. Like, when they'll drop them off after working out and you're out there banging on a forge, or on an anvil, it's pretty cool on the reputation side.
Got it. All right. So step number 3 is figure out your budget, not just for your time, not for just your money, but for your time.
Yep.
What is step number 4?
Do a lot of secondary research, right? You did a lot of research in the beginning. Go back and if you're having issues, use the resources out there, because it's really it is a frustrating hobby in a lot of different ways. And sometimes you won't understand something until you've tried it. Like you're like, oh, like on Fortune Fire, they'll be like a hollow grind versus a grind. I'm like, whoa. And then you're like, oh, I totally get what it is. And then if you're not figuring out how to do things a certain way, go to what you would typically do, right? It's amazing how people start something. Like when my kids are a great example, right? They'll be like, I don't know how to do this. I'm like, well, what do you not know how to do when you're in a game? You're playing a video game. Oh, I go on things and I search for the answer. I'm like, there you go. So find the resources to keep you engaged and maybe trying new things. And then, you have that sort of freedom to be able to say, oh, today I want to make a really unique kind of knife or something. Well, I'm going to go out and look into this. And then seeing how to do it first replaces, if you're lucky enough to have someone local, but even my mentor is like an hour and a half away. So if I want to make a different kind of knife, I have to go online and look at it. And again, even for stuff like, hey, I found a bunch of good steel, right? A lot of people make railroad spike knives. Okay. You go to different forums, they'll tell you, don't waste your time, or it's great practice, or they make decent knives, but it's not like super highly engineered, high carbon steel. And by doing that research, you can make decisions tied into that budget of time and money. Like, hey, I really want to make this kind of knife. Well, you might read it needs a certain kind of steel. It's going to take you a really long time, all that. And you might say, I'm okay spending a month on this thing. Or you might look and say, I want to do something else in the meantime. But really use the stuff out there. I found it really, really helpful. And it's funny, I've diverged a little bit from how I was taught, where he had done it for so long. I think he's past the point of just like screwing around like I do. So he had very, very specific jigs to get certain grinds like perfect. But then I will watch on a video and someone will be doing like a freehand grind, which is a very different thing because you're just freehanding it. And I was like, I really want to learn that first. Like I learned the other way first, but go back and learn feeling how, because little variations on where your body is, and you could totally screw something up. And I think connecting with it that way, but I wouldn't have learned that had I not gone online. And I think it also, when you're getting discouraged, spending time in forums and videos and talking to people renews your passion, because you'll get discouraged and you're like, and when you're mad, you don't want to throw a knife that you screwed up on, but you'll be like, oh, why am I doing this? Like I spent so much time. Like I've had ones where I spent a really long time. Like I think I might even have it. Like I was making this really beautiful pommel for this thing. And I went to like weld it, because I'm teaching myself how to weld at the same time. And it should have been intuitive. But I was like, oh, the heat to weld steel versus aluminum, very different. The aluminum caught fire. I'm like, I didn't think that would happen. Completely trashed it. Well, that's when you're like, I'm done. I just, and you go down, you watch a video, you ask people like, hey, what do you do? They're like, of course, you're an idiot. You didn't know that would catch fire. But I think that helps keep you engaged.
And you and I have talked about too before, finding your learning style, right? Like,
yep.
Some people want to go watch the YouTube videos. Some people want to read like a breakdown or see the stagnant diagrams versus something more dynamic that's,
yes.
a video. And so figuring out where your resources are for your learning style, I think is important too.
Oh, totally. And the nice thing about this is I think once you have the basic, you always want better equipment, but once you have everything, you're in the good position to do that step forward, right? Like you're like, hey, it might be something like, oh, it's a setting on your grinder, or hey, have you tried this? And or just watching it sometimes. And again, 3 and 4 are also very tightly tied together, because when you're buying all the equipment and you're executing on your budget, right? Because with the budget, I'm assuming you're buying some things. There's wide varieties, and some people are purists. Some people are like, I would never buy anything unless it was this brand. And you're like, okay, but I don't have $2,500 sitting around. So like I bought my grinder on Amazon, and Steve was like, hey, it may be good. Like, give it a shot. Like, you always send it back. And a really good American-made grinder was like $2,000. This was like $950. And I haven't had any real problems, right? Like it's got some less features, and like there's no on-off switch. Like you got to just plug it in, unplug it. But I saved $1,000. Will I upgrade? Maybe at some point, because now I know that I still want to do it.
Yep, that's important. All right.
And well, the other thing is, and one other last thing on 4 is, and I kind of go back to the Forged in Fire thing because it's a good exposure, kind of what got me exposed. But the other thing that doing research and just spending some time of your budget just surfing and looking at that kind of stuff is you'll get exposure to different kind of knives you might want to make. In the beginning, we were talking about people kind of taking them for granted. If you said to people, like, what is a camp knife versus a Bowie knife versus, they'd be like, I don't know. You know, they know like what they've seen in movies. You know, the one Resident Evil movie, she's got the cookery knives, right? And they're like, oh, I know what that is. But you may come across something and go, okay, I really want to build that. And you can go about it the right way. And that's, you know, that research is helpful in that regard.
Do you think that there's a lot of, I mean, as someone who doesn't know knives really well, there's a lot of different paths that you could take in terms of like
100%.
Sub-specialize, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it does go back to the why, right? So if the why is to potentially have it as a business, a lot of what you'll read out there is get really good at one kind of knife. And a lot of them really recommend a chef's knife. There's a really cool guy I used to watch on YouTube, and his name eludes me. He was one of the judges on Forge and Fire in the beginning, but he was talking about that. He's like, you can make all these different kind of knives. People will plop down $300 for a handmade chef's knife when it's a beautiful thing for a gift for somebody, because it's something that is like utilitarian and beautiful and commonly used. This is not going to be like what someone's going to get their wife. Some people, but not necessarily. Although in political climate, you never know. But generally, I think there are different ways you can go. I have very much gone in this being a hobby, an artistic expression, a way that I can give gifts to people. I gave a gift to one of my West Point classmates who had been doing an awesome, like my daughter was in Charleston for the summer and he was there and he hosted her and he did very, very well. So I'm like, what can I give the guy? And I'm like, I'm going to give him a knife. And it was one that I built with Steve, my mentor's beautiful chef's knife. And I said, I've got it on display. Like, what? Why is it? It's not about. So I gave it, and that shifted my why. Right. Now this is about maybe giving them away, like not connecting to them. And I think that's where I'm not even going to say specialization. That's kind of my why I'm doing it. And then there's not that certain pressure. Now, I do think people have sort of favorite knives, right? And I think that's a good and a bad thing. I think it's good because you get really, really good at it. But it's, for me, it's fun going, okay, like this one, I had a really small piece of steel and I'm like, you know, this would be a nice little stiletto, you know, maybe gift for the wife or something. But like, I want to make a lot of different ones and kind of try different things as opposed to becoming specialized. But I do think also you kind of go a certain way. Like, are you like a purist? Do you really want to like, there's two ways to make knives, right? You can forge them. So you could take like a block of steel and bang it into the shape that you want. Or you could take a piece of steel and grind it down to the shape you want. Or a mix of both. People have different preferences. One's a little bit easier and a little bit more exact. One is kind of, you're not getting sweaty as much. You know, you're still going to heat treat it, but it's a different connection to it, right? So yeah, I think people find what they like.
That's kind of interesting that there would be that kind of subspecialization.
Yes.
What is step number 5?
Well, you know what? Going to 4 to 5 is a good thing because also part of the research should be all about safety, right? Like,
Sure.
In terms of danger, right? Like there's dangerous hobbies. People skydive, people all do this, but you're talking like sharp things, fast moving things, a lot of particulates in the air.
Hot things.
Safety, hugely important. And I would be lying if I didn't. So right here, that's where I ground part of my finger off.
Yep.
And like, if you talk to any guy, they've got Band-Aids on their fingers if they do this, but safety is really, really, really important. And safety glasses, all of that, and researching how to do things safely. You know, when you're pulling hot steel out of the forge, like you realize why people are wearing like an apron, right? Like I didn't have a really good apron. My other Father's Day gift was a really nice leather apron. When you're budgeting things, not a bad thing to buy. First thing, you'll save money on shirts because I've got shirts with burn holes and other stuff in them. But secondly, it's really, really safe because I've had times where I've been done banging on things or whatever. And I'm like, oh, I didn't feel it. My apron caught that. So safety is hugely important. And part of all this, and part of the reason why it's good to shadow someone in the beginning and keep researching, is because you're going to see people doing safe things and continuing to tell you to do the safe things. So number 5 is practice. And it kind of goes without saying, but it gets back to where I didn't feel like I was getting the practice. And I was kind of doing like all this different stuff. And it really is getting out there and saying, it's almost like working out, right? Like saying, here's my time budget. Here's how much I got to spend on each knife. I'm gonna do that, right? And you may find efficiencies. Like I know some people, when they light up the forge, they have a bunch of knives they've been working on that they'll heat treat, right? Because propane could get expensive. You know, there's a reason to do all that, but kind of get out there and do it, because it truly is one of those skills where you're like, oh, I get it. And then you'll be like working and you'll be like, oh, I screwed that up. I get it. Like where visually you got it, but then like just being off again, a little on your body, or doing something stupid, or like quenching at the wrong time, like all these different things. And usually it's rushing, right? You've rushed a step, you want to get to, and I think practice slows you down. And then if you've done all the other steps, the practice is a focus practice. And I think I made the mistake of kind of being manic. Like I would have something on this workspace, something over there, something over there. And I'm like, oh, I'm working on it. But it wasn't like, that's really hot. I'm going to work on this to a certain point. And then while that cools, I'm going to go do this. It was just like, oh, I'm bored with this now because I've been grinding for an hour and I'm not happy with it. And that's the wrong practice. And I think that focus practice of like, how can I really, really get better at something? And how does it, like I picked up like little things, and I don't even remember if anyone taught me this, but like while I'm sanding this down, putting this here will keep certain grinds in place, right? And when you practice, you're like, oh, like I screwed that up and I spent a shit ton of time doing it over again. I'm not going to do that again. And if you don't practice, you won't do that. And don't give up until, like, if you have put your heart and soul in it, don't give up until you've given yourself a certain amount of time to practice doing it. Because what you'll see is, if you looked at the first ones I built versus the later ones I built, or the ones where I salvaged it, and there's a great story with that, where I was watching Forge and Fire, go figure, and one of the guys on there was like, oh, that guy, you just put a spacer in there. You're like, oh, okay, I've done that, and I feel like a moron and terrible at this because I had to put a spacer in because something didn't fit the right way. And I was like, no, actually what happened was I've been practicing enough that I know that's how you solve the problem. Right? Like even the guys who do it all the time have those problems. And until you practice and you're like, oh, I totally get why that is the case. So, and I know we got to go to the biggest mistake.
We do. Biggest mistake.
The biggest mistake is looking at a mistake as a mistake. And, I've seen a bunch of videos and guys say this. They're like, unless it's unsalvageable, like a big crack or something like that, throw it aside and do something with it later. And that could be everything. And I think the biggest mistake is people are like, oh, that didn't turn out the way I wanted. And there is something to that. Like one time I was told, like the argument of like the steel will tell me what it wants to be is someone lazy not figuring out why it's bending. And that's true. But there's also a side that says if I did it wrong and it's bending, I'm going to set it aside and figure out what that can be. This, again, was supposed to be a Bowie knife, and it was terrible. But it ended up a chef's knife because I'm like, okay, I threw it on the scrap heap, but then I also went back and said, why did it not turn into what I wanted? So there's like two sides of a fortuitous mistake. I made another cool knife, but then I also had the chance to learn something cool. And I think too many people just hold themselves to a standard, and all that stuff out there is sort of a headwind with it, right? Because there's like a Facebook group I'm in that's like introductory knife smithing for beginners and experts, right? But you see the beginners, and so I go on there and guys are like, here's my third knife, and you're like, okay, I quit, I'm done. And I'm like, okay, one, this guy probably had some other technical skills where they were transferable to this, and others, it's like masters and beginners. So someone will put one up there, just finish this baby, and you're like, okay, maybe I'll get there, maybe I won't, but I can't compare myself to that, and I got to get out there and practice if I want to ever be like that.
Well, that's the same thing with social media, though, too. Like the people who make craptastic third knives are not up there posting them like, "Hey, look at my third knife." If it looks like it, came from a used robot from the 1970s, they're not going to throw it up there. It's the ones who make really nice third knives. They're going to be like, "Look what I've done."
Oddly enough, there are people who are like, hey, they will post their beginner stuff. And what's really cool is it's not like, hey, you schmuck. It's like, great job. You maybe could have done this. Here's what, when are we going to see your next? Like, it isn't that like it is, but I think it's a matter of the perception, right? So someone posts like this beautiful blade and you're like, whoa. And what went into that, right? Like now that's where it's sort of that if you're running like a distance race where you hit that wall, that's that wall where you're like, oh man, like I know how hard that is. And then you're like, okay, then you might look at their profile and they've been doing it for 10 years consistently. Like, again, I've been doing this for about 18 months, but again, there was a break in there. I get to it when I can, and I'm okay with that because of where my budget is. But once I get the last kid out of the house,
Good luck with that.
Now, unfortunately, I can't give any of the gifts to my divorce clients because I'm not giving knives in the middle of a divorce.
Probably not a good idea.
There you go.
Not the message we're sending. I want to thank everybody for listening. You are listening to the Getting StartedLife podcast with Doug Katz and Marya Pleasant on the WGSN-DB Going Solo Network. If there is something that you want to learn more about and we haven't had them on our show yet, let us know what you want to learn about. We will find an expert and we'll get them on. If you are an expert at something like knives or anything like that and you want to share with the world, we'd love to have you.
Wait, can I throw one out here?
Yeah.
We've never said this before, but I would even say if someone has been on the show talking about a topic that you know about and you disagree, come on and tell us what your 5 are, because especially in light of this and during the interview, this popped into my head is if I had gone with somebody other than Steve, if someone else had taught me, it might not have been as good a connection. And as a result, I may have not gone into it. So, if we can bring someone on to talk about a topic again, if you've got something passionate that you're passionate about, as long as you're not rehashing what we've done before, we'd love to have you on.
Well said. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you in 2 weeks.